so those are his, those are his rules of wrestling. And then of course he goes into it from there. People ask me, well, what does it look like? And so we have some examples from a little bit later of kind of what the sport of wrestling might look like, because Pietro Monte teaches quite an extensive curriculum of it, of things that he says. He's very critical of wrestling that, for example, starts on the ground, right? He says that, you know, like in war, you're not going to do this, and this is a bad habit. Just go to the ground. Just go to the ground. So he's very critical of that. And he also says that if you have to strip to wrestle, right, if the same things can't work when you're fully dressed or in your armor, this isn't good either. I mean, it might be perfectly good sport, but it's not good to train warriors. So, but he says, you know, these are the sorts of things that are good, but you can train really hard and not and keep training. And so he doesn't include breaks and, you know, some of these things. And it looks a lot like, if I had to describe it, Monashir, that looks a lot like a cross between, say, a really good judo player and a Greco-Roman wrestler, right? As you'd expect, in that clinch, you know, standing wrestling, some grapevining of the legs from judo, but not, you know, maybe even a little bit of freestyle. Abrazare, the more war wrestling that we have, is somewhere between that and what you'd expect to see in classical jiu-jitsu, in the sense that it has, you know, it has arm bars, it has strikes into the joints to break them. It's grappling, right? It's not wrestling, lota, but it's grappling with all that goes with that. And whereas Monte is teaching wrestling, lota, L-O-T-T-A, and he's not teaching strikes. Now, one thing I get asked a lot is, we don't really see any chokes. Where are the chokes? And so my thought on that is as follows. It's the same reason I don't think we see a lot of wrist locks. You don't really see kotegaeshi in Western material. And I think the reason for that is that you can't wrist lock somebody in European armor doing the same thing. The armor will lock up and protect them before you can lock the wrist, right? There is a German equivalent. And what it is when they grab you in your gauntlet, you grip these two fingers and these two fingers and you tear them apart and then turn the wrist over the elbow to create an elbow control. But that's an elbow control. That's not really a wrist turn. And so I think the reasons we don't see the chokes is that, frankly, in sport, they weren't permitting them. The chokes don't work in armor. And instead, what we see are neck breaks, right? If we're going to fight in war, I'm not going to spend time trying to choke you out. I'll just kill you. I'll just kill you and get on to the next guy. So, you know, right. And, you know, and so an arm bar in armor, your armor might protect the joint from being locked, but I still have control of your skeleton and I can still drag you to the ground or throw you or whatever. So we don't see a lot of submission holds in the wrestling.
You know, this is very interesting. You know, as you say, whenever you make a statement in martial arts, you make some enemies, but I really need to mention that. But I'm sure all of us have been observing it. As much as I love wrestling and grappling, as you know, now I went back to Kyokushin, as you know, and I'm doing Kyokushin.
Yeah.
Because I realized this, to be honest, okay, part of the reason is that my back healed after 11 years of suffering, right? So I can kick high again.
Yeah, of course.
But then I realized one thing, and I'm going to tell you that. I'm a wrestler. I don't let them bring me down. And if I go down, I can stand up. Why am I saying that is this? Watch the MMA today. No one stays on the ground anymore. Those days are gone. Those days are gone. So now I realize back then, and I'm talking as a wrestler, guys. No, I'm not talking as a Kyokushin guy. I do both. I'm talking as a wrestler. So once you know two of them, now I tell you, why should on earth should I stay on the ground? And we are not talking about weapons, we are talking about strikes. Because as a Kyokushin black belt, I can strike hard as well. So I don't go to the ground. And now imagine, this is only empty-handed. Now add weapons to it, you know, and this exactly. You know, now add weapons, which, you know, is multiplies your force and is much more dangerous. We see that, like, again, as I mentioned in one of our interviews, like the way Mastival knocked out with a knee strike, takedown attempt, right?
You know, we had up until he passed away, the famous Carlson Gracie Sr. lived his last few years here in Chicago, and he came to help with his son's school here. And I'm not a BJJ player. I have students who are BJJ players. You know, my student Shannon, she's a BJJ player. I'm not. But we ended up having a student in common who was a good friend who was also a Wing Chun instructor. And so we would go out to get something to eat. And so it'd be Carlson Sr., who was just a delightful man, and spoke very little English, but we somehow always managed to figure it out. And Phil, the Wing Chun guy, and myself, and we would talk about weapons and grappling, and he would get so frustrated with the students in his school who wanted to do MMA as opposed to just gi and no gi BJJ, because he'd constantly be screaming at them, "Getty uppy, getty uppy," and meaning get up, because they would take someone down and then they would just, or they'd go down and they would just want to pull guard. And it was like, that's great in a context where no one's going to kick you or, kick you in the face or pull a weapon. And so, and so my point is, no one, Carlson Gracie Sr. certainly didn't need to justify his credentials in ground fighting. But he absolutely identified that it was a very different world when we're talking combat.
Of course.
And so, yes. So the medieval grappling is stand-up wrestling. It is grappling because it has strikes and arm bars and breaks. It is really somewhere in between what you think of as Western freestyle or Greco and jiu-jitsu. And like I said, the things that are missing are the things that are submissions. So.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask another question. Two more questions I have.
Yeah.
Could you talk about chivalry code and the value system in your school or in general
Yeah, I will. I'm going to preface this a little bit, Manashir, by saying that, I think it's fair, and I think anybody listening, whatever their political spectrum is listening to this call, will agree that we've been living in a really hard time in the world, and not just this last year, but the last few, as I think a lot of old systems are feeling strained. People politically don't know if their governments are serving them. People don't know where they fit in. There is a fight between progressivism and traditionalism. There is a fight for people like you and me who tend to think of ourselves as fairly progressive people, but see the value in tradition, not to let tradition be co-opted for something it is not meant to be. And consequently, it is easy to dismiss things like, say, chivalry, right? That, well, look at how violent the era was. Clearly, these people failed, right? And as I said, by that measure, democracy is on its third attempt in the Western world. So we could say it's an unchosen, unproven experiment too. But I tell you what, dictatorships are the proven form of government, and that doesn't mean I'm in any rush to go jump into one, right? So, so the same with chivalry. And and there's a lot we could say here about its connections to Persian chivalry, which seem to really this. I get a little tired of the idea that everything came out of the East, or everything came out of the West, or everything came from India. But this is one case where we can say that there is definitely a connection between, the Persian culture of chivalry and how that slowly transmitted east, and the Western experience of it, and the way that the Crusading era changes the notions of chivalry. There's a lot that happens in that period, and that's a whole lecture. But what I will say is that chivalry arose as a fusion of Germanic warrior ideals with Christian virtues, and was an attempt to deal with the paradox that any warrior culture deals with, which is that I practice a religion that is based around peace, but I'm supposed to maintain that through violence. And it's a paradox, right? And even if my religion isn't particularly one that emphasizes peace, at the very least, society certainly values peace. But I maintain that through war. and you have to rationalize those things. And chivalry was an attempt to try to do that and to try to figure out how members of the warrior society could deal with each other, as well as deal with those not of their class. And different people saw it in different ways. Everyone wants to know what the list of virtues are. I could give you a list that some writers give, but it's never the same. There's no written code. You know, everyone's like, what's the code of chivalry? As if it's like something that the Boy Scouts recite that I could just tell you, you know. And it's like that isn't what it means. It's a far more intimate and personal and changing thing. And the writers on this explain that. What's interesting is it is hard baked into these medieval and Renaissance texts. They refer to it themselves as the knightly art or the chivalric art. Fiore symbolic diagram of the perfect warrior, right? Standing here with all these symbolic animals around him, he's supposed to encode. So they are strength, speed, prudence, and courage. And but the strength is actually fortitude, and fortitude, prudence, and courage are three of the four cardinal virtues in Christianity. So you can see this whole idea, right, of trying to fuse these ideas.
Interesting, because there are the virtues of Aristotle as well. This, you know,
Of course. Oh no, and those four animals are laid out in order, Monasher, in the order of the Platonic elements. So you start with earth. You start with earth. You start with earth in the south, strength. You move to speed, which is water in the east. You go to prudence, right, in the north, which is air. And then courage is fire in the east. And in Christian thought, it's in the east because Jerusalem is in the east, and beyond Jerusalem is Eden. So it's the map of the cosmos, and the man is at the center harmonizing everything. And so my point is that even if someone doesn't buy any of this, even if you're an agnostic or an atheist or you don't care about symbolism, what they're trying to teach you is this idea that you have to harmonize yourself. And this is what I think is really fascinating, is that Fiore is getting at the idea that strength is important, but strength without prudence is imbalanced, right? Courage, that virtue of fire, you know, as you know, everyone would think the mind is the most important, modern people. But of course, the highest element in Plato is fire, right? Courage, it's what powers everything else. He says if you lack courage, you should not practice this art. But courage, you know, has to be tempered as well. And so, the idea is that
because Aristotle said if it's not tempered, it is recklessness, and then it is not courage anymore. Excuse me, I don't know why it just reminded me of him.
No, exactly. Well, but of course we're talking, you know, Western martial arts, and Aristotle is he's so important in medieval thought that he isn't even called by name. He's just called the philosopher, as if there weren't any others, right? He's the philosopher. And so, right. And so you see it there. And so consequently, there is this idea that you have to show these things. And so I'm gonna really give you an idea of how we practice this here. So we do talk about chivalry in my school. We've done some lectures with them. Christian Cameron did a great one when we first went into shutdown on Zoom about chivalry and changing notions of chivalry for us. And actually, we did kind of a dialogue. But one of the things that is a great example is that justice is a virtue, a chivalric virtue, right? But so is mercy. And sometimes this is something that a number of years ago, I had a very sharp debate with a colleague from my old days in the Japanese Koru world, because, you know, they had found someone who had a fraudulent credential. And of course, they were excoriating him and wanted to purge him. And my point was that, but he's never claimed to teach anybody this art. He did pad his resume. He was the one who announced it. He wasn't dragged out by others. And everything he's ever taught anyone is legitimate and tied to his legitimate credentials. So that doesn't make it right? And justice is to have to deal with that shame and loss of face and all the rest of it. But mercy is also to not seek to destroy someone's life over what is not a reprehensible crime that can never be overcome. And that is a decidedly, obviously a carryover from the Abrahamic Trinity, right? It's not necessarily something we would see in the Far East, this idea of mercy. But it is baked in here. You know, the European sword with its two edges are justice and mercy. And it's something we could use a lot of right now. You know, again, I consider myself a pretty progressive person in my politics, as anyone who knows me on Facebook will know. But I also find myself very, especially in martial arts circles, concerned with the huge desire to cancel people that you don't even know, right? That, you know, oh, well, I heard through someone who heard through someone who accused this instructor of this thing, and I don't know them, but I'm going to share this, and I'm going to destroy this, try to destroy this guy's life and livelihood. So again, that isn't justice, and it is not mercy. And if you profess to study these arts and you believe that you can leave that aside, you've actually missed the point of what these things can do for you. You're just reducing it to a sport where you hit someone with a sword or throw somebody over your hip. And that's fine, but don't pretend that you have any more virtue in doing that than any street fighter does, you know, or a guy who is playing golf, because you've missed the whole point of the martial arts. And so for me, this stuff is relevant. When we teach children, because we do teach kids, my student Jesse, and you know Jesse really well, one of my provosts, Jesse makes every single lesson on one of the chivalric virtues, and he makes the kids pick who embodied a given virtue in a given day, and he makes them write little papers on how they can use some of these things at school, right? Because prowess is definitely, every list has prowess in it, physical power and strength and skill. But it's never the only one, and it's often not the first one. And so, you know, so it is important, and it is something that we teach. And I know a lot of modern HEMA schools just roll their eyes at it or ignore it. And honestly, that's a level of postmodern cynicism I don't have time for.
Very good. And could you talk about your publications, your books, articles? I'm going to put a link. So,
well, I mean, if I have to.
Tell us, please.
Sure. So, I you know, I am a writer by profession, and I told you my degrees were in journalism and history, so it only made sense that would all come together. And so I was very fortunate to, back in 2002, publish my first book, which was a translation on the work of Filippo Vadi called Arte Gladiatoria. I did that with my friend Luca Porzio, and to make it clear, Luca was the principal translator. My job was to polish the translation, and then we wrote all the analysis and front matter and historical commentary together. So that book is probably 60% Luca, 40% Greg, you know, maybe 65% Luca, 35% Greg. I don't know. It's been a while now, but it was a great project. Luca comes from a Japanese martial arts background. He's not active in HEMA and hasn't been in many years, but delightful person, and I was really grateful to have that chance. I then went on to become an editor for a now defunct publishing company, and when it went belly up in the mid 2000s, and a number of the writers were involved, including myself, in some legal action because they had not paid royalties in years. My friend Christian Tobler and I decided to start our own publishing company, which is Freelance Academy Press. And so we founded Freelance in 2010 as a HEMA publisher. And I will point out, though, we do more than that. We do things on medieval history. As you know, we carry your books, and we're hoping to expand. We carry my friend Alice Almdor's books on traditional Japanese martial culture. And so it was really meant to fill that gap. But it also provided a venue for me to publish more. And so I did put out a couple of books as an editor, which also gave me a chance to get some of the articles I had written on Fiore or on the Bolognese School into publication. Those were called In the Service of Mars. And that was my first real crack at translation. I translated the section on poleaxe from one of the Bolognese manuscripts. And my students, Nicole and Dave, helped me do a full photo interpretation of that armored poleaxe. And And then I didn't really publish anything for a while until a few years ago when I finally decided, okay, damn it, I still can't believe we don't have an actual good, true academic edition of Fiore's works out there. We have a lot of, kind of one step above Google Translate. And so we set out to create the Flowers of Battle project, which was meant to create a translation and edition of all of the different manuscripts in the tradition. And so the first volume came out in 2017, and it is called Flowers of Battle. And Tom Leone and I did that. Tom is the translator. I didn't touch a word of the translation. I did write a good chunk of the 200 pages of front matter, though. And we talk about arms and armor. We talk about chivalry. We talk about the judicial duel in Fiore's day. So it really is a book that isn't meant to just give you the manuscript, but to really set the tone of Fiore and his world and the history of his students, some of whom were very famous, and then to launch the whole series. The next volume was done with Ken Manchin, and that is from the manuscript that Ken found about 10 years ago. He found a fourth Fiore sitting in plain sight in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris.
Yes.
But it was just under this strange humanistic version of the term flower of battle. So instead of Flos Duellatorum, it was Arte Florius de Luctandi. He was like, huh, that sounds like some sort of, humanistic Italian trying to label this thing like an ancient Roman. And sure enough, there it was. And so that volume is out. The third volume would have been available already, but COVID got in the way. So I'm finishing that for preparation now, and I hope to have the whole series done by 2022.
Can I ask you a question? Have you considered switching completely to digital books, or are you one of those who resist, like me, say, I still want to publish books?
So, yeah, okay. So we make a lot of our books available in both formats. And I don't hate digital books. I read a lot of novels that are just for fun. I will read digitally. If it's something important that I would like to be able to have a copy wherever I need it, I might buy both formats. But for me, anything that has value that I want to come to, my academic books, for example, they're books. They're physical things I can take off a shelf. And also, digital books are not good for things that need to be very visual, very photographic. For example, your Arms and Armor from Iran would be a joke as a digital book. You would never appreciate. I mean, sure, I could take the photos and I could scale them and blow them up and do all that, right? But it just does not have the same visual impact on people as the physical book does. It just doesn't. And there's been a lot of studies that show that also, that people respond to the physical book differently than they do a digital one. So,
I mean, the last point of